What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of Assassin's Creed Shadows. The next entry, of course, into the Assassin's Creed franchise, this time bringing us to feudal Japan with our dual protagonist. But before we dive into all that, some qualifiers and everything. Now, normally this is where I would tell you about the 100% reviews, but obviously that's not what this is, so I can spare you much of that. But essentially, I'm able to bring you this review because I was provided a review key a couple weeks ago towards the beginning of March to check this game out. Now, the sort of catch there is that the review keys were provided via Ubisoft Connect, so even though this game is coming to Steam, that is not the platform I played it on for this review. Now, usually that would be fine. I would just 100% it on Ubisoft Connect the way I did with Star Wars Outlaws, actually, and show that instead. But the thing is, in the sort of pre-release version of the game for these review keys that they've sent out, neither the challenges or the achievements for the game were in place, so I'm not bothering to label it that way. Now, this will also affect a couple of other things. For instance, the game is supposed to be verified on Steam Deck, but I didn't really test that for myself because while you can get Ubisoft Connect working via the desktop mode and try to do things that way, that's not really the experience most people are going to have with that. So I decided to hold off on that and, not jump through a bunch of hoops to get an ultimately different experience than the people playing it on Steam Deck will likely have via its native Steam release, just as a few examples. Now, bringing it back to the game itself, I personally have not played the Assassin's Creed franchise in quite some time, since Assassin's Creed 2, in fact, but after taking a look at the game via a remote preview and some, just requests from the viewers, really, I decided I would go ahead and review this one and jump back into the franchise. And unfortunately, for the game, I guess, I have to say that I don't recommend this one. I jumped back and forth between giving it a buy on sale or a do not recommend after having a pretty middling time with most of the game, but then ultimately I ran into some significant technical issues right at the sort of end of the run, like the last 3 to 4 hours, give or take, and for me that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back in this case. And then when you combine that with the microtransactions, other technical issues, I had half-hearted gameplay and progression systems and a story that wasn't really wowing me. Over the course of this review, I think you'll see why I ultimately gave it a do not recommend. Now, that's not to say it's all bad, however. There is a few things in this game I liked. For instance, Naue as a character, our actual sort of assassin character, both her sort of personal story alongside her gameplay actually I think fits the narrative and what they were going with much more aptly than, say, Yasuke's. And that combined with the other addition of like the scout system, which gives you a way of clearing map markers and objectives without just, following actual quest markers, was pretty neat stuff. But ultimately, it's not enough to make up for all the things I just don't like about this. So let's dive into that with perhaps the most egregious thing, which is the microtransactions. Now, microtransactions are nothing new to the franchise from what I know, but while I initially thought this would just be cosmetic skins, digging a little deeper into the microtransaction store that they have in place here, there's very clearly like pay to progress type stuff. And in fact, in one case, you can even buy a pack that just marks everything on the map for you, which is worth a mention because the proverbial towers that are here don't actually mark absolutely everything. You can also buy things like resources to upgrade your hideout, which are otherwise kind of annoying to collect. And you can even just straight up buy gold, or the currency of the day, Mon, which just doesn't make any sense, seeing as you really don't need it much for the actual in-game portion anyway. But the microtransactions also sort of pull back to what they are calling the Animus system. So this is like a organizational tool in some sense, in that it will allow you to launch all of the different Assassin's Creed games that you own, I suppose. But this is where you'll also access things like the store and the other part of this, which is the exchange and then the Shadows projects. The exchange, you can use keys that you get from actually playing the game to exchange for various little items and things, not all that dissimilar from the way Ubisoft has done their challenges in the past. And then there's the projects. So the Shadows projects are, I guess, akin to something like a battle pass almost, but they seem to be free, at least at the time of this video. But basically, by completing little missions that you'll get in the game world itself, you'll earn progress towards these projects, and then you'll earn rewards for having done so. And honestly, this just seems like another way to monetize a game that seems to be unnecessarily monetized with microtransactions to begin with, considering the game is $70. Now, personally, I don't like seeing microtransactions in a single-player game at all, but I admit that purely cosmetic stuff is whatever to me for the most part. Now, I will say that when you start including things like utility, etc., while it is theoretically possible to add those things in a way that is sort of optional and not infringing upon the game in any way, I also find that it provides a financial incentive to game developers to then slow or create progress centered around being so slow that you would want to pay to speed those things up in the way that we see with like just the resources in this game. So not a fan of any of that, frankly. And then from there, let's get into the technical side of things. So some of the technical problems I experienced, namely a fair few of the crashes, of which there were quite a few, probably at least a dozen or so over the course of like 70 or 80 hours with this, those were related to a driver problem. You see, a thing about playing review copies is that, well, sometimes the drivers you have will be fine. Other times they are not up to date with what the game is expected to run on when it launches, which was the case here, and NVIDIA had not released the driver for this, and I had not received that driver through the game developer themselves, which sometimes is a thing. And as such, the only driver I had available for my 4090 at the time just seemed to not be compatible with the game, and this would cause a crash every so often. I obviously hope that gets fixed with the launch, but it's very annoying for me personally. That said, it was not the only issue I ran into, but the rest were comparatively minor right up until I got to the end of the game, in which I came close to something that I would consider game-breaking. But on the smaller side of things, there's a lot of visual stuff, I think, things like clipping and whatnot or whatever, but you would get stuck on terrain a lot. Unsurprisingly, the landscape of Japan can be a little extreme, especially when you're coming down a mountain, and it wasn't unheard of then to get stuck on some of that terrain that clearly you're not necessarily meant to be walking through much. And while that's fine, it would also occasionally just happen while you were climbing things, and in certain places it seemed like the game just didn't know quite where to put you, per se. Now, on the much more problematic side of things, towards the end of the game, after completing a certain main story cutscene, so to speak, immediately after that, the game would no longer let me sprint, and it would no longer let me save. Like, clearly what was happening is my character was getting stuck in some sort of combat state or something like that, because I could still do everything else, even fast travel. But the second I did this cutscene, no matter what else happened around it, I could no longer sprint, and the game would not let me save anymore. And I was able to ascertain that this cutscene was doing it because I could no longer save. It just kept kicking me back to the autosave right before that cutscene, during which I could totally move around normally and save or whatever. And then the second I went through that cutscene, the game wouldn't even autosave after this. And I'm not sure why my character couldn't sprint, but it made doing the last few hours of what I needed to get done for this review painful, to be honest. And in any other context outside of doing a review, I probably would have just stopped playing there. So at least for me, I would describe the technical state of this one as not great, frankly. Now, luckily, everything from the performance side of things was mostly okay. Every once in a while, the game would freeze for a couple of seconds, which I'm not sure if that was related to the driver issue I was having or if it was its own standalone thing, so to speak. But moving on a little bit, let's next talk difficulty, because when we actually jump into the game, you do have a few options gameplay-wise, including difficulty, guided exploration, choices you can make, that kind of thing. So on the difficulty side of things, most of what this affects is obviously like how quickly enemies will detect you, the damage they deal, and how they can react to you, the player. Basically saying as the difficulty goes up, enemies are smarter and faster, basically. Now the catch there is there's only one difficulty above normal, and on normal and below, everything is laughably easy, to be honest. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think Assassin's Creed is really the type of game that people are going into expecting some hardcore challenge, but I will say that in a game where you have all of these sort of pseudo-RPG elements like gear and stats and everything, it just seems to mostly be pointless, because what really matters is just what level your character is alongside what your masteries are, which are your skill trees, basically. But if you're having trouble for whatever reason, there are a variety of difficulties you can adjust, and then the extra stuff like guided exploration allows you to either turn off completely the quest markers and use the scouts and stuff instead as the game is intended, or if you just want the quest markers, you can turn that on straight away. You can also turn on cannon mode, which forces the characters to make specific actions instead of getting to make choices here and there, though in my experience with this game, the choices don't ever seem to have any consequences, actually, so most of those don't really matter. The only one that seemed to make much of a difference is when you were recruiting certain members for your hideout, which we'll get to, you do have the option to to turn those people away, which would then give you less people at your hideout and stuff, which seems to be the only substantial consequence to any decision you could make, which is as good a time as any to talk a little bit about the story. Now, obviously, we're a couple days away from the game's release, so, a spoiler warning is probably worth a mention at the start of this section. I'm not going to be spoiling much, and truth be told, I don't think there's much story in this game to spoil, but nonetheless, if you don't want to hear any of that and go into a blind, obviously skip this section. But ultimately, the story of Assassin's Creed Shadows is the story of Naue and Yasuke and their fight against a cabal of people set around feudal Japan, specifically in the late 1500s. Straight away, I will mention that this period of Japan's history has actually been seen in video games pretty frequently, specifically around the life and death of Oda Nobunaga. Now, probably worth a mention, though, that while this game does use historical events to add context and a sort of timeline to things, none of it is really aiming to be historically accurate either. Nonetheless, though, we're going to play as these two dual protagonists across a tumultuous time in Japan's history is ultimately what it comes down to, and this sees us trying to largely reacquire a box that is stolen from Naue's father, who's clearly part of a secretive sect himself, which is the Assassin Brotherhood, after it is stolen by this cabal of ne'er-do-wells seeking to influence Japan, of course, and much of the story is basically just tracking those people down, and assassinating them, if you'd believe it. But a couple of other notes. For one, you play much of the introduction to the game as Naue. Like, Yasuke is not available as a character until you get a pretty good ways into the story. I was probably like 10 or 15 hours into this before he really joined up, which surprised me a little bit. And at that point, you kind of got two problems. One, I've been playing this other sort of main protagonist all up to this point, and it also has the other problem of Yasuke honestly not quite getting as much story as Naue does, especially since he comes in with his own playstyle, which I have some issues with. Ultimately, though, I would say this is a story about revenge and then turning that revenge or quest for revenge into something more, while also building a network to help you exact that revenge via our sort of hideout. And somewhat, to my surprise at least, as somebody who hasn't played this game series in quite some time, so maybe this is normal, I guess, but there was precious little about the Brotherhood and the Templars. It's in there, kind of towards the end, but it's pretty minimal in terms of its impact on this game. But broad strokes opinion on the story, it was fine, I guess. The parts of it I enjoyed were Naue's personal story about trying to get revenge for her father while also growing from that experience, and then Yasuke comes in and he's just kind of along for the ride, and then I think a lot of the writing around about how him and Naue suddenly become super close friends almost immediately is just really weird. But otherwise, pretty much all of the main story objectives are just tracking down individual members of this cabal, doing a couple of quests to smoke them out, and then killing them, and that's kind of it. So, it's fine. It just, doesn't really do anything more than that, which was okay for me, I guess. But then we have the progression side of things. So there are a variety of progression mechanics with this game, and for the most part, it's fine. You always feel like you're progressing, and in some cases, like for instance, gaining the knowledge ranks and then the masteries, or your skill trees basically, and even building up your hideout can feel satisfying enough. I would say my main problem with progression is really down to things like the gear and some of the sort of tertiary RPG systems, because a lot of those just feel like numbers for the sake of numbers without adding anything impactful to the experience. And what I mean by that is that your level really does seem to matter more than anything else, because this increases your base stats, and then as long as your gear isn't like woefully behind your level, and you're not trying to fight enemies that are way above your level, you're unlikely to run into much of an issue. In fact, even within that context, sometimes I was still able to do stuff I probably shouldn't have been able to do, because the melee combat in particular just isn't particularly difficult. You basically dodge or deflect most stuff, and then counter, and then things like your abilities actually give you some iframes to avoid damage. And even some of the masteries, which we'll get into, give you abilities and things that are more about taking out segments of an enemy's health rather than like dealing a specific amount of damage, which means that altogether, a lot of these more number-oriented systems about increasing the damage of a specific weapon or a slight percentage increase to your adrenaline gain just don't really matter much. Now, the one exception to this is that you can engrave a lot of your equipment with like special perks and stuff. And some of those are impactful, especially the ones that allow you to do extra health segments on your assassinations, which can be stacked with things like masteries to then just instantly assassinate very, very high health enemies. But put all together, I think a lot of these systems feel disjointed. But now let's actually talk about some of them. So we have the hideout first and foremost. A little ways into the story, we gain access to a space that we can build and customize to our heart's content. Now, most of this is just optional little bonuses that are helpful. I would say the forge is really the most important building to update, and then you can also do missions and things and side quests, that kind of stuff that will give you access to extra scouts, which can help you find quest objectives and perform other tasks like gathering resources by smuggling them from caches out of castles and stuff. And later on, if you upgrade the scout building, you can even have them perform some tasks for you. But I say the forge is the most important because that building gives you access to the ability to upgrade and engrave your equipment all the way up to the game's sort of soft level cap of 60. You can continue to level after that into what are called master levels, but master levels only provide an increase to your mastery points and not any more stat increases, as a matter of fact. So let's talk about knowledge and masteries now. So knowledge points are basically just used to increase your knowledge rank, which increases the level of masteries you can obtain. Basically the skill nodes that you can actually invest in. We gain knowledge points typically by just performing little activities out in the world, completing events at shrines and things like praying to various shrines, or collecting lost pages from scrolls at other shrines, or some player-specific activities like, for instance, meditation for Naue, or engaging in things like, say, horse archery for Yasuke. But once you get enough knowledge points, you go up in knowledge rank, which gives you the option to, of course, get those better and better masteries up your skill tree. But the thing is, that only goes up to level 6, but there are 2 more knowledge ranks after that. Ranks 7 and 8 give you access to sort of knowledge paths, which are basically just global passives that you can increase things like your just base damage with, that kind of stuff, which is okay. Now, I will say the masteries for each character do wind up feeling pretty impactful. In fact, this is where Naue is going to get a lot of boosts to her assassinations, as an example. And if you invest in things like her shinobi, tools, and katana, she can actually be really good at melee fighting, even though she's supposed to be more of the stealth shadows character, who is very fragile in normal combat. But you can absolutely get to a point where she's just as deadly in, just a full-on brawl as Yasuke is. At least for the most part, because Yasuke fully upgraded is a walking tank. Nothing can kill him. You get health back on kills, you get just incredible adrenaline gain to just immediately keep using your abilities, which give you iframes. And Yasuke's playstyle, as a result of that, which we'll talk a little bit more of, actually just kind of feels out of place in this game because he's just a walking juggernaut. But then we have our gear. So the gear you get is based on your level, including unique items. You can get unique items, which are going to be the things you use the most because of their unique effects. They're all whatever level you are when you get them. The thing is, you can take those back to the forge at your hideout and then spend resources to upgrade them to your current level, or whatever your forge's maximum is, all the way up to the level cap of 60. As I've already mentioned, most of the actual numbers on this stuff seems to be completely irrelevant, but the effects that you can get from the actual base item and then what you can engrave onto them additionally at the forge does actually get pretty impactful, because you can add things like additional health segments to, say, your assassinations to sort of just make those assassinations kill even more and more difficult targets in a single hit. But there's also all sorts of other elements you can add to this as well. So ultimately, while some of this was okay, I would say that a fair bit of progression, if anything, just seems to be, again, numbers for the sake of numbers that doesn't really do anything, which is only really relevant because of how the world scales to your character as you move along. So while there are, when you start the game, areas that are much, much too high of a level for you, as your level increases, so does all of the world with you, which is why your just base level seems to matter more than anything else does. But that brings us to the gameplay and world of this one. So unsurprisingly, and much of what I expected here, is the fact that this is a checklist open world with a variety of things to do. We go to various towers or high points in order to reveal map markers around, and then we go check off those activities. But I will say that there are some things you won't actually see unless you go exploring, to the game's credit. So while the towers do mark off everything important for you, there are some things that you will not find just from doing that. You have to actually go explore and look for them. But that stuff was mostly pretty minimal and didn't really affect the game much, but at least there is some exploration outside of just these towers and their checklists associated with them. In fact, one thing that comes up a fair bit is that the game this time around uses seasons, and it uses these seasons as a way to both refresh and advance the world in some ways. Like, for instance, if you go through and wipe out an outpost, when the season changes, that place is going to get renewed, so to speak. And then the season changes also clear bounties on Yasuke and Naoe, which are mostly pointless anyway, alongside refreshing your scouts as an example. But outside of that stuff, it's also generally pretty useful to just get up to a high point and then use your eagle vision or observation to find quest objectives. And this is how, outside of the scout system, you're going to track down where various things are. Basically, the quest itself will give you a few hints about where this thing is, but then when you are in any given area, you can sort of observe, which is to sort of zoom in and mark resources and things that might be happening around you on your sort of display here. And then you can, of course, track things down that way. And that's how you can sort of more finely tune exactly where a particular quest objective might be, even though you don't know the specific location once you're in the general area. Because if you don't want to find it yourself, you have to use the scouts from your hideout, which you can increase the number you've got by upgrading your hideout and the associated building, but also just by recruiting some of them by doing side quests and everything. But most of those side quests are kind of dull and tend to be like, kill 100 of these people, or basically just tracking down a particular group or ring of various targets for whatever reason because they're relevant to that thing. So assassination of various quests. NPCs. Now, the thing is, most of those side quests are really dull, and there was only one or two of them that were fun to engage with. There's one that involves a string of child abductions, which was by far the best one in my opinion, and really the only one that actually stood out to me. And then there was another one that actually involved some yokai and stuff. I thought that one was kind of cool as well. But by and large, most of the side quests are monotonous and they don't really add much to the game or flesh out the characters or the world even. Outside of the very specific personal quests of Yasuke, Naoe, and their hideout characters, because when you clear main story objectives, this will often put you into contact with certain characters that can join your hideout, which get a very little short intro quest line before they formally join you. But most of what we're going to be exploring the world doing, outside of just, tracking down story objectives, of course, is exploring various little outposts and castles, things like that, taking down targets in order to get their loot that they've got. For instance, most castle locations have a few sort of leaders in the area that you can take down, which then gives you access to the reward chest there. And then those locations are often rich in resources as well, which you can assign your scouts to smuggle for you, which is where you're going to get most of your hideout resources, or just collect some of them manually when possible. And that, in addition to the character-specific objectives like the meditation points for Naoe or horse archery for Yasuke, as I mentioned, are things you can get up to in the world. And for the most part, it's fine, but it didn't really wow me. Now, we can, for the most part, freely swap between Yasuke and Naoe. Now, when you're in a dangerous place, it won't let you do this straight away. You have to sort of be in a safe location in order to do it. And what's more, oftentimes, you'll have a choice to play certain story missions as one or the other, which will, of course, slightly change what is happening in those missions, but, it all ends the same way. Now, there are, however, some quests and things like that where you have to play through them as a specific character. They're personal stories, obviously, and then some locations can actually only be accessed by one or the other. As an example, Naoe cannot move these large movable crates you find in some places, and there are these little dungeons called coffins, which are effectively tombs you have to navigate, and some of those have to be done by Yasuke, as an example. So to answer a question I'm assuming people are going to ask, while you can play most of the game as one or the other, you are going to have to switch. One of the ways the game encourages you to do this is by implementing a bounty system. So if your character is caught during their stealth sections or whatever else, sometimes an enemy will run to ring a bell, and if you don't manage to stop them and they ring that bell, you are assigned a bounty for the rest of the season for that character. But it fades afterwards. The thing is, that's pretty much the only way that bounty impacts the game at all. When you have a bounty, obviously, some bounty hunters occasionally spawn in, but you can avoid them or just fight them. And then the guards that'll wander around the various towns will attack you on sight at that point. But that's pretty much it. Civilians don't really change or react to you in any way, and in fact, if you kill civilians, you'll still desynchronize like you would in the past games, which effectively forces you to load a save. So the bounty basically only applies to this, and it really just seems to be a mechanic to try to pressure you into occasionally switching characters more often. And the thing about that is, when you switch characters, that character doesn't have the bounty, and the bounties are only province-wide anyway, so it's really just not much of a setback. Which, again, is just one of the ways these systems feel a little half-hearted, frankly. But from there, let's talk about combat. So combat comes down to Yasuke and Naoe. Each of them have their strengths and weaknesses, and obviously a different gameplay style. Naoe is our assassin, she's much better at parkour and everything. Yasuke is the big melee guy, who's going to tear everything apart as a samurai. But the main thing I want to get across in this section is that while Yasuke is incredibly powerful, chewing through everything that moves, I would say this sort of like unkillable juggernaut playstyle is not supported by the game's melee combat very well, because that's basically what Yasuke felt like, an absolute unkillable killing machine. And the melee combat is so simple that there's just not enough here to really warrant that, and it's just kind of a power fantasy that gets old after like a couple of fights. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, all there really is to melee combat in this game is that when the enemy flashes white or blue, you can deflect those attacks. Blue attacks indicate a flurry, so expect follow-ups. If they attack you with a red ability, you're supposed to dodge out of the way of that, and if you time it right, you'll leave the enemy vulnerable, which is also the same if you deflect properly. When an enemy is vulnerable, they take increased damage, and then things like your weapons and whatnot can provide various status effects like bleeding or poison, though they don't typically do much damage, and so unless you're combining them with other effects like Yasuke's masteries, which will allow him to just insta-kill enemies that are bleeding under so much health, there doesn't seem to be much of a point to them. Now, on our end, we can use some masteries as an active ability. When we use those abilities, we actually activate some iframes at the same time while that ability is in play. And between that stuff and Yasuke's ability to sort of just regen health every time he kills something with some of his masteries, unless you've just never played a video game before, I don't see how you could possibly die playing as Yasuke. And that's completely ignoring how his sort of upfront kill everything you see style doesn't really fall into line with what I would want from an assassin-oriented game. And as such, Yasuke just kind of feels like he doesn't fit here, and what his gameplay style is just also isn't supported by the melee combat of this game. Like, I don't think that combat is strong enough to support a character like Yasuke, because there's just absolutely no threat to him at any point. Now you flip that then, and then you look at Naoe. Naoe is obviously much better at assassination, she's much more mobile, she's better at parkour, and what's more, when you get her masteries going, she's actually also pretty good at melee combat. But the sort of combat gameplay that I enjoyed the most with her was finding various ways between both her mastery and her gear to increase the amount of health she would just destroy people with in terms of her assassinations. Now, some of her masteries give her the ability to assassinate samurai with frontal attacks, and attack targets that are otherwise immune to assassinations at the beginning of the game. So some of her progress just allows her to assassinate bigger and bigger targets more easily. And that was what I enjoyed, sort of, getting that progression of not being able to attack these guys with assassinations initially, only to then turn around and use gear and those masteries to be able to just take out the biggest targets possible in a single hit, and then either just running off immediately or holding my own ground in melee after that, with a character that felt like she might actually die if I mess something up. And that's kind of the bulk of why, for me at least, Naoe seems like the sort of intended way to play this game, and Yasuke just feels like a power fantasy that doesn't fit in. And there's obviously a little more to these things, like for instance, there are ranged options. Yasuke can use either a bow or a teppo, which is like a rifle. And Naoe gets various tools she can use, like, kunais, shurikens, and some more useful distracting tools so she can get in and sneak through places. So while I enjoyed a specific portion of the combat experience with Naoe, the bulk of it was just kind of underwhelming to me. Which brings us to typically where I would put the Steam Deck section, but as a little reminder here, because of the review copy only being through Ubisoft Connect and the fact that this is supposed to be verified on deck, it seemed a little silly not to use the native Steam release version of this to test the Steam Deck with, because that would obviously just be a different experience from what you, the people presumably watching and potentially buying this, would get. So I didn't test it out here, but hopefully it is actually verified and runs well there, but we'll have to see. Which brings me to the positive and negatives. So on the positive side for me, it was basically the assassination gameplay, Naoe as a character in her personal story, and a few of the other side systems, like the scout system, and using that as a way to sort of obfuscate quest markers was fun for me. I enjoyed that. I think that's a novel way of approaching a system like that. And there's even a couple other things on that sort of front that I didn't get much of a chance to mention, like for instance, the HUD is pretty customizable. You can display how much of that as you want basically, and there's a host of accessibility options which I thought were great, but unfortunately, that just isn't enough to outweigh all of the negative things I saw with this title. The microtransactions and their implementation, the technical problems I ran into, the fact that Yasuke's gameplay doesn't feel like it belongs in this game. Most of the story was underwhelming. So much of progression with things like gear seems like just bloated, half-hearted systems. Which brings me to my conclusion. As I mentioned towards the beginning, for me, I was kind of going back and forth between a buy on sale and a do not recommend for this one. And that's largely because I don't think everything about this game is awful, but I also just didn't really enjoy the bulk of it either. And ultimately, for that reason, and the fact that I think some of the core things it's trying to do just don't really work for me, I'm gonna give it a don't recommend. And that's largely because I think the only situation where I could see myself buying this game even on sale and being happy with it is if I picked it up for like $10 or $20. And obviously at a base price of $70, I think the deluxe edition is like $90, plus all the microtransactions they've crammed in there. It's frankly just a pass for me, but ultimately I'm just one guy. If people do pay for this and enjoy it, I hope it's what they wanted out of it. And if anything, I would encourage people to watch reviews from people who have played more of the Assassin's Creed franchise than I have. But from my perspective, after jumping into this game, after so long away from the franchise as a whole, I was pretty thoroughly unimpressed by this one, which is obviously the reason for the don't recommend. I think that's pretty much going to wrap up this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.